Well, Trevin Stratton is the Vice President of Policy and the Chief Economist for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. He was following the report from the Bank of Canada today and the remarks of Canada's Finance Minister. He joins me now. Mr. Stratton, good of you to take the time to speak with me today. Nice to talk to you.
Thanks for having me on, Peter.
Look, let's start with the Finance Minister's pledge to keep on pouring out the pandemic spending as long as it's needed. Does the Chamber of Commerce support that approach?
So I think part of the debate is that it's become very polarized. On the one hand, you have some people calling for austerity, and on the other hand, you have a number of people saying that interest rates are going to be low, as the governor of the Bank of Canada signaled today until 2023, so we can spend unlimited amounts of money. I think in many ways that really misses the point, which is the return on investment of what we're spending. Certainly all spending isn't created equal, and some types of spending will actually have a greater return on investment for the economy, for growth, for Canadians than others. And those are really the questions we need to be asking when it comes to spending. But definitely, there are a lot of businesses that are suffering in some of the hardest hit sectors, like in travel, tourism, accommodation, and food services and restaurants, the airlines, and also energy companies as well. And so some of this targeted support is definitely going to be useful for some of those companies that almost rely on physical presence for their business models to work.
Well,
Now that
let's,
parts of the country
I want to dig into that a little deeper as we get into our conversation. But on that, having said that, in your view, is the pandemic spending the government's been doing so far providing what you would look at as a valuable return on investment? Is it the right kind of spending so far?
So I would definitely agree that having a number of businesses being able to bridge to such a point as a vaccine created, or we get the pandemic, the health aspects of the pandemic under control, is very useful, and it will help accelerate recovery. But I think we need to look at the numbers, and that's one of the challenges with the speech today. So, for instance, there was a report that came out from RBC a couple weeks ago, showing that around $30 billion extra went out in CERB payments versus the amount of salaries and wages that were lost in the second quarter of this year. Now, that $30 billion could have been spent on other aspects of economic recovery, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's childcare too. And so, definitely looking at the spending and what is the return on it is going to be very important. But that's what is also challenging right now. We have the throne speech, we have this speech today. A lot of economists like me and a lot of people in the business community are waiting for that fall economic update that should be there in November, where we can actually be able to look at the numbers and determine, what is the actual return on investment.
All right. So
spend.
on the numbers, she's making no mention today again of fiscal anchors, and the Prime Minister has said we won't hear about fiscal anchors and what the government's going to tie its fiscal plan to in terms of prudence and and its plan for post-pandemic. We won't get that till much later. She did talk about something today called fiscal guardrails to steer the government spending. How concerned are you that there hasn't been any commitment from the government about how finances will be brought back under control?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely looking for a long-term fiscal plan, whether that's an anchor or a guardrail or whatever word you want to call it. I think that would be very useful just in terms of context of the spending that's taking place and how we actually determine the longer-term plan. Because as we saw from the Bank of Canada today, we're not necessarily looking to reach our pre-pandemic size of the economy until 2023. And so we need to, at the same time as we're thinking about supporting businesses and Canadians right now over the short term and bridging them, we also need to be looking at the longer term impacts of this spending too. And so things like fiscal anchors are definitely useful.
Okay, let's talk about the Bank of Canada. You touched on it. Some bleak economic news from the governor of the bank today about how long the economic recovery could take, well into 2023. We saw new information from Stats Can today about how many businesses have been affected. So what does this outlook mean for those businesses and others in Canada?
Well, it means, I think the one thing that the Bank of Canada was trying to communicate is that we're in this for the long haul. So, there were two changes that we saw from the previous monetary policy report from July. Number one is that the economic hit in 2020 isn't going to be as bad as initially thought, though it's still very bad. But secondly, that this is going to be much more prolonged than we also initially thought back in July too. And so, for a number of those businesses, those ones that really do rely on physical presence, they're in this for the long haul. But looking at some of those other numbers that came out today, not from the Bank of Canada, but from StatsCan, I mean, the numbers are huge and concerning. So at the height of the crisis in May and June, June, there were about 100,000 fewer active businesses in the country. We clawed some of those back, and the latest numbers that came out today are from July, but there are still 85,000 fewer active businesses in Canada than there were before the
And
pandemic.
let me ask you on that. So, and many of those businesses are struggling under the under pandemic restrictions, which vary from province to province, which come and go. It would seem as health and political officials try to sort of manage where the pandemic's going and how to curb the spread. How does your organization feel about those restrictions and whether they've been applied fairly?
Well, we need to be able to live with the pandemic in our midst while still engaging in economic activities. Obviously, it's up to health experts and public health experts to determine those things at local community levels and at provincial levels. But figuring out, what is the safest way to be able to continue to have economic activity or to have the fewest amount of those businesses fail is a very important balance that we need to find.
Okay, let's finish on this. Let's look ahead. So, in your view, as the government looks to, and we heard some of that from Christopher Freeland today and from the governor of the bank as well, about what a recovery needs to look like and what it needs to focus on. From the Chamber's point of view, what does a robust recovery plan look like for Canadian business, and what role does the federal government play in that?
I mean, it's getting Canadians back to work, and I think what the way to do that is having a business-led recovery. Because most of the jobs in this country are in the private sector and are from businesses, and so it's economists like me. We talk about a K-shaped recovery. There are those sectors that are hurting, that are on the bottom side of recovery of that K, and they're going to need this type of targeted support to bridge them through. But those sectors and those businesses that are on the top end of the K, and there are some sectors that have been able to adapt very successfully, some of which are actually their economic activity is bigger than it was pre-pandemic at this point now. They're going to need the types of policies that encourage business investment. They're going to need the types of policies that encourage business growth going forward too. That's looking at things like tax policy. It's looking at things like regulatory policy, reducing interprovincial trade barriers. These are things that can have a huge impact on our economic growth.
All right, Trevin Stratton from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Good to talk to you. We'll talk again.
Thanks, Peter.